K2 rises from the Karakoram range like a piece of exposed bedrock pushed into the sky. It stands on the border of Pakistan and China, far from cities, roads, and permanent settlements. Even by the standards of the great mountain ranges of the world, it is isolated. The nearest villages are small and distant. The route to its base camp takes days of walking through glacial valleys and barren stone corridors where the landscape offers little shelter and no margin for error. At 8,611 meters, K2 is the second highest mountain on Earth, but its reputation is shaped less by its rank and more by its structure. The slopes are steep and technical. The ridges are narrow. The summit pyramid is sharply angled, and the weather arrives with little warning. In summer, when climbing is possible, the air still carries winter's cold. Temperatures remain far below freezing at high altitude, and the wind can turn moderate conditions into something unlivable within minutes. Snowfall is unpredictable. Visibility can collapse suddenly, erasing landmarks and turning familiar terrain into blank white. The upper mountain is a place where human movement becomes slow and deliberate. At extreme altitude, the body loses strength with every hour. The margin between control and collapse narrows, not because of drama, but because of physiology. K2 is sometimes called the Savage Mountain, a name tied to the simple reality that retreat is often as dangerous as continuing. On its upper slopes, decisions cannot be undone easily. The mountain does not negotiate. It only waits. In the summer of 2008, K2 drew an unusually large number of climbers. The year was considered a major attempt season. Weather forecasts suggested that a summit window might appear in early August, and several commercial expeditions and independent teams arrived at K2 base camp with the same objective: reach the summit during that brief opening, then descend before conditions closed again. Base camp sits on the Godwin-Austen Glacier, surrounded by ice, rock, and moraine. It is not a permanent settlement, but a temporary staging area built from tents, supplies, satellite phones, and small routines that help climbers hold a sense of normalcy. Here, climbers eat, sleep, monitor the weather, and prepare their equipment. They also watch the mountain, waiting for the one opportunity that might justify the weeks of effort required to reach it. The primary route used by most teams in 2008 was the Abruzzi Spur, the most commonly climbed line on K2. It is not a simple route, but it is the most established. From base camp, climbers move upward through a series of camps. Camp I is typically established above the icefall and steep lower slopes. Camp 2 is placed higher on the spur, and Camp 3 is positioned on exposed terrain where winds are stronger and oxygen levels are already low enough to slow basic movement. Camp 4, often called the shoulder, is the final camp before the summit push, typically located around 7,900 to 8,000 meters. Above Camp 4 lies the most feared section of the Abruzzi Spur, the bottleneck. This is a narrow traverse beneath massive hanging ice formations, where climbers pass through an area exposed to falling ice and rock. The route is steep and often protected by fixed ropes placed by climbers and Sherpas earlier in the season. These ropes are essential, not only for upward movement but for descent. When fatigue and oxygen deprivation make balance unreliable, the climbers on K2 in 2008 came from multiple countries and backgrounds. Some were experienced high-altitude mountaineers with years of Himalayan and Karakoram climbing behind them. Others were strong climbers but with fewer 8,000-meter peaks completed. Several were clients on guided expeditions, relying on team leaders and high-altitude workers for logistics and support. Some teams were independent, coordinating informally with others while still operating under their own decisions. Among those present were climbers from Norway, France, Serbia, the Netherlands, Italy, South Korea, and other nations. Not all of them were aiming for the summit at the same time, but the shared pressure of a short weather window pushed many groups toward the same schedule. The mountain itself imposed a strict calendar. K2 is not climbed year-round. Even in summer, storms can hold teams in their tents for days. Supplies are limited. Physical strength declines with prolonged exposure to altitude. Every expedition carries the same understanding: waiting too long can mean losing the chance entirely. By late July, climbers had moved through the standard acclimatization pattern, climbing to higher camps, sleeping briefly at altitude, then descending to recover. Fixed ropes had been placed along key sections of the route, though not always with complete redundancy. The bottleneck area remained a critical obstacle, and its safety depended heavily on the stability of ice above it and the integrity of the rope line below. At base camp and in the higher camps, anticipation grew as forecasts suggested a possible summit window around August 1st. Teams began preparing oxygen bottles, checking regulators, packing food that could be eaten quickly, and sorting gloves and down suits. In the thin air above 7,000 meters, even small tasks become exhausting, and preparation is often done slowly and carefully. The plan was straightforward in concept: climb to Camp 4, rest briefly, then push for the summit overnight, reaching the top in the morning, and descend the same day. It was a standard strategy for an 8,000-meter peak. But on K2, standard plans do not guarantee standard outcomes. The mountain's steepness and narrow route create congestion. A delay of hours can become critical. And at extreme altitude, the cost of delay is not measured in inconvenience, but in oxygen, strength, and time. In 2008, many climbers would step onto the Abruzzi Spur believing they were approaching the best opportunity they might ever get. On August 1, 2008, climbers began moving upward from Camp 4 toward the summit of K2. The timing was consistent with standard high-altitude strategy: start in darkness, climb through the coldest hours of the night, and aim to reach the summit in the morning. This reduces the risk of being caught high on the mountain after nightfall, when temperatures drop further and navigation becomes harder. But from the beginning, the ascent was slow. A large number of climbers were attempting the summit on the same push, and the route above Camp 4 narrowed into steep terrain where only one person could pass safely at a time. Bottlenecks formed below key sections, especially in the traverse beneath the seracs. At this altitude, delays are not neutral. The human body cannot remain indefinitely above 8,000 meters without consequences. Oxygen runs out. Hands and feet cool rapidly when movement slows. Exhaustion accumulates with every minute spent standing still. The bottleneck itself, a steep couloir below massive overhanging ice, forced climbers to move beneath unstable formations that could not be controlled or predicted. This section had long been recognized as one of the most dangerous on the mountain. Climbers moved through it quickly when possible, clipped into fixed ropes for security, and tried not to remain directly under the ice longer than necessary. As the morning progressed, some climbers reached the summit. Others turned around due to delays and worsening conditions. The descent began while more climbers were still climbing upward, adding confusion and crowding to an already narrow route. Then, later that day, the mountain shifted. A section of ice high above the bottleneck collapsed. Accounts differ on the exact timing and scale, but the outcome was clear: falling ice swept across the route. Fixed ropes, essential for descent, were damaged or destroyed in places. Some climbers were struck. Others were cut off from the established line of retreat. Above Camp 4, there are few safe areas. There is no forest, no sheltered valley, no alternate road downward. The terrain is steep and exposed, and the cold increases rapidly once the sun drops. By the time the collapse occurred, many climbers were still high on the mountain. Some were near or above the bottleneck. Others were already descending but now faced sections where the ropes were gone and the path they had relied on no longer existed in the same form. At that point, the summit attempt was no longer the central problem. The problem became simple and immediate: how to get down alive, from a place where retreat had suddenly become uncertain. After the ice collapse above the bottleneck, the descent route on K2 became fragmented. What had been a single narrow corridor of movement, held together by fixed ropes and shared assumptions, was now partly severed. The bottleneck was still physically passable, but the safety system that allowed exhausted climbers to descend quickly was no longer intact. Above 8,000 meters, small problems do not remain small. A missing rope forces climbers to downclimb steep ice without reliable protection. A delayed descent extends exposure into the late afternoon. A misstep can become fatal because the terrain offers no recovery. Even if a climber survives a fall, rescue is nearly impossible. As the day moved toward evening, several groups became separated. Some climbers were stranded above the bottleneck. Others were trapped below it, unable to move upward safely to assist. The summit ridge, already difficult, became a corridor of scattered individuals, each working within their own limited oxygen supply and fading physical strength. The conditions at that altitude are physiologically punishing. The air contains roughly 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level. Breathing becomes rapid and shallow. Judgment slows. Hands lose coordination. A climber can understand what must be done but lack the physical ability to do it efficiently. Those descending faced a decision that had no clean answer. Continuing downward without fixed ropes meant taking extreme risks on steep ice and rock. Waiting for help meant spending the night in the open, at temperatures that could kill through exposure alone. Some climbers attempted to improvise. Others searched for remaining rope lines, trying to locate sections that had survived the collapse. In several places, ropes were tangled, buried, or cut. Where a rope had been torn away, there might be only ice and a drop beneath it. There was no stable shelter above Camp 4. The terrain consisted of angled snowfields, exposed rock, and narrow ledges. If a climber could not reach a tent, they had to create a temporary refuge with their body, their clothing, and whatever small depression in the snow they could find. For some, the night began while they were still moving. Descent in darkness on K2 is slow and uncertain. Headlamps offer only a narrow beam, and at high altitude the mind struggles to interpret what the light reveals. Snow can hide edges. Ice can appear flat until weight is placed on it. For others, movement stopped entirely. Several climbers remained high on the mountain, forced into bivouac positions, sitting or crouching in the snow, clipped to whatever anchor could be found, or simply holding themselves in place. In this environment, the body does not rest. It fights. Muscles tense to maintain posture. Shivering burns calories rapidly. Frostbite begins quietly, often without immediate pain. The difference between survival and death often came down to whether a climber could keep their circulation moving and their airway clear. At this altitude, a person can slip into hypothermia and lose consciousness without realizing it. The cold does not arrive like a dramatic wave. It accumulates slowly until the body's systems fail. Some climbers still had supplemental oxygen. Others had already used theirs during the summit push. Oxygen was not only a performance aid, it was a survival tool. Without it, the brain and muscles deteriorate faster. Decisions become slower. The ability to downclimb technical terrain becomes unreliable. As night deepened, communication became inconsistent. Radios were limited, batteries weakened in the cold, and climbers were spread across a wide vertical range. Even when messages reached base camp, there was little that could be done immediately. Helicopters cannot operate effectively at extreme altitude, especially at night. Rescue teams would have to climb upward through the same dangerous route, risking their own lives. The mountain structure made coordination difficult. Camp 4 sat below the bottleneck, but above it, the terrain narrowed and rose into the summit pyramid. Any climber trapped above that point was essentially isolated from the last established camp. At the same time, those who had reached Camp 4 were not necessarily safe. Camp 4 itself is exposed. Tents can be damaged by wind. Climbers arriving there after the collapse were often exhausted, dehydrated, and mentally disoriented. Some were already suffering frostbite. Others had impaired movement due to altitude sickness. Descent from Camp 4 to lower camps is still serious climbing. Even if the upper route could be navigated, survival was not guaranteed until the climber reached significantly lower altitude. In the Karakoram, weather can change suddenly, and the route down includes steep sections where mistakes remain fatal. Throughout the night, some climbers attempted to help others. But above 8,000 meters, helping is limited by physical reality. A person can barely manage their own equipment, let alone assist someone else down technical terrain. Pulling another climber, sharing oxygen, or supporting a descent becomes nearly impossible when every movement causes breathlessness and muscle failure. Some climbers who were stranded attempted to descend without ropes by carefully down-climbing, using ice axes and crampons, and anchoring themselves to what little equipment remained. Progress was slow. Each step had to be placed deliberately. A slip could mean an uncontrolled fall into the couloir. Others waited, hoping daylight would make route finding easier. But daylight brings its own hazards. Warmer temperatures can destabilize ice. Sunlight increases the risk of further sérac collapse. The bottleneck is dangerous partly because of what hangs above it, and that risk does not disappear after one collapse. As the hours passed, the mountain began to claim people quietly. In several documented cases from the 2008 disaster, climbers disappeared during the descent. Some fell. Others were last seen moving downward and were never found again. In that terrain, a fall does not always leave a visible trace, and recovery is often impossible. By the early hours of August 2, survivors were scattered between the summit ridge, the bottleneck area, and Camp 4. Some had managed to descend below the most dangerous sections. Others remained trapped above, weakened by cold and hypoxia, with no guarantee of assistance. The efforts to regain the route continued in fragments. Small groups formed briefly, then separated again as different individuals moved at different speeds. A strong climber might descend faster, but leaving others behind carried its own moral weight. Yet staying could mean death for both. In this environment, the concept of teamwork becomes fragile. The mountain forces each person into a narrow calculation: oxygen remaining, body temperature, strength in the legs, feeling in the fingers. It is not selfishness. It is survival arithmetic. Some climbers made it down to Camp 4 after spending the night exposed. Others reached it late, barely able to function. Those who arrived could sometimes drink melted snow, change gloves, or sit inside a tent briefly. But the camp was not designed for extended shelter. It was designed for a short pause before summit or descent. Above them, the mountain remained full of unresolved situations. Climbers still stranded. Equipment lost. Rope lines broken. A route that had been temporarily usable now looked uncertain in daylight. The disaster was not a single event. It was a sequence. The collapse had been the turning point, but the true survival crisis unfolded hour by hour afterward, as climbers attempted to descend through terrain that no longer offered predictable support. And by the time the morning sun rose over the Karakoram, the upper slopes of K2 were not simply a place of mountaineering challenge. They had become a scattered field of human endurance, where survival depended on whether the body could continue to function long enough to reach lower ground. As August 2 progressed, the situation on K2 became clearer in fragments rather than in a single coherent picture. The upper mountain could not be seen fully from base camp, and radio contact was incomplete. Information arrived through brief transmissions, delayed reports from descending climbers, and the absence of expected arrivals. Attempts to organize rescue began almost immediately, but the constraints were severe. Above 7,000 meters, any rescue effort becomes a climb in itself. A rescuer must carry oxygen, ropes, and medical supplies while also moving through the same exposed terrain that had already been destabilized. Every step upward adds risk. Some climbers at lower camps attempted to move up to assist those still stranded. But the route above Camp 4 remained compromised. The bottleneck was still threatened by hanging ice, and the fixed rope system had been damaged. To climb upward through it would mean entering the same danger zone that had already caused the disaster. Weather and altitude further limited options. Helicopter rescue was not realistic at those heights. The air is too thin for standard rescue operations, and the mountain's steep faces provide no stable landing areas. Even if a helicopter could reach high altitude, extracting a climber from a narrow ridge or couloir would be nearly impossible. The result was that rescue depended on the survivors themselves, on their ability to keep moving downward. As climbers descended through the day, the human cost became undeniable. Multiple climbers died during or after the collapse, including those swept away by falling ice and those who fell during the chaotic descent. Others were last seen alive but did not return. In several cases, the exact circumstances of death could not be confirmed because no one was close enough to witness it clearly. Some climbers reached Camp 4 with severe frostbite. Hands and feet were damaged from exposure during the night. At extreme altitude, frostbite progresses rapidly, especially when movement slows. The body prioritizes core temperature, reducing blood flow to fingers and toes. Once tissue freezes, damage becomes irreversible. Exhaustion was equally destructive. After a summit push, climbers are already depleted. Add prolonged exposure, oxygen loss, dehydration, and psychological stress, and the body begins to fail in ways that cannot be reversed by willpower. Movement becomes uncoordinated. Speech becomes slow. Basic tasks like clipping a carabiner or tightening a strap can take minutes. For some, the descent below Camp 4 still required technical focus. Mistakes remained possible even after the worst terrain was passed. Several climbers who survived the upper mountain would later collapse lower down, not because the route became easy, but because their bodies had reached the limit of what could be sustained. Meanwhile, the missing climbers remained unaccounted for. On K2, a person can vanish without leaving evidence. A fall can carry someone into crevasses or down steep faces where recovery is impossible. Snow can cover traces quickly. Even if a body is located, bringing it down is often beyond the capacity of any expedition. By the end of the day, the tragedy had taken a defined shape. The 2008 K2 disaster would eventually be recognized as one of the deadliest single events in the mountain's climbing history, with 11 climbers losing their lives during the summit attempt and descent. The failure was not simply a failed rescue plan. It was the reality that rescue, at that altitude and on that terrain, is limited by physics. The mountain does not allow second chances easily. Once the ropes were gone and the route collapsed into uncertainty, the survivors had only one practical option: descend under their own power, before the mountain took more time than they could afford to give. By the afternoon and evening of August 2, those climbers who had survived the night above the bottleneck gradually reached lower camps. Camp 4, once a staging point for the summit push, now served as the first relatively stable location for regrouping. Here, climbers could sit, change gloves and boots, drink melted snow, and recover enough to continue downward to Camp 3 or base camp. The descent remained slow and careful. Even after the most exposed sections were behind them, exhaustion, frostbite, and altitude sickness persisted. Some survivors moved in pairs or small groups, assisting each other where possible, but there was no coordinated evacuation. The mountain permitted only cautious, deliberate progress. Base camp remained the reference point. Supplies and medical attention awaited there, though limited in scope. Satellite communications were used to inform authorities of the missing climbers. Helicopters were not deployed to the upper mountain due to altitude and terrain restrictions. The rescue efforts focused on those who could still move under their own power. As survivors arrived, they were often silent, focused on immediate needs rather than recounting what had occurred above. The loss of colleagues and the uncertainty surrounding others cast a quiet weight over the camp. There were no celebrations. No relief speeches. The mountain had exacted its toll. By the end of the day, 11 climbers had been confirmed dead. Several more were presumed lost in inaccessible terrain. The survivors would continue to recover physically and emotionally in the days that followed, but the record of what had happened above 8,000 meters was now established. The route had failed them, the weather had not favored intervention, and human endurance had been tested to its absolute limit. In this context, survival was quiet. It was measured not in triumph but in the mere fact of reaching lower ground alive. The mountain remained unchanged, unforgiving, imposing, indifferent. The immediate crisis ended. The survivors were physically safe, though not untouched by the events above. K2, for all its beauty and challenge, had demonstrated once again the limits of human intervention at extreme altitude. The 2008 K2 disaster stands as a sober illustration of the limits of survival at extreme altitude. 11 climbers died in a series of events that began with an ice collapse and were compounded by narrow routes, delayed descent, and the inherent challenges of operating above 8,000 meters. Rescue was constrained not by effort, but by physics, altitude, and terrain. The event revealed the fragile balance between human ambition and environmental reality. Even the most experienced mountaineers, with technical skill and preparation, remain vulnerable to the mountain's indifferent forces. The bottleneck, the ice seracs, and the exposed ridges above Camp 4 are a permanent reminder that K2 does not negotiate. Historically, the disaster influenced subsequent climbing strategies, emphasizing caution, staged acclimatization, and respect for the unpredictability of high-altitude terrain. K2 endures as a measure of both human aspiration and natural constraint. Silence remains the mountain's final authority.